Excellent. Well, I've got to say, it's a tremendous honor to have been asked to come here and to say a few words at the start of this conference. And also for the conference to be themed good thinking. That's a huge, huge honor for me, and I'm tremendously delighted to be here. I'm sure, hopefully, some of you will know that I work for a charity in the UK called the Good Thinking Society, set up by Simon Singh. And I'm in the very fortunate position of being a full-time skeptic. I'm the only full-time employee of the charity. And even though we're a fairly small team, so it's myself, and I work closely with Simon, and my colleague Laura, who does fantastic work. Despite us being a small team, we've had some reasonable successes of late. I'm going to be talking about those tomorrow when I'm speaking. And we're fortunate enough that we're actually hopefully starting to push back the tides of unreason, even to a point where, actually genuinely just this week, it was on Wednesday, David Tredinnick MP, who's one of our stellar brains in our government, enough people know of David Tredinnick, but he went on the parliamentary record to insult our charity on Hansard. It's absolutely extraordinary. He's there in Parliament talking about good thinking and calling us a one-man-and-his-dog operation. And I'm not sure which that makes me, whether I'm the man or the dog, but neither is particularly flattering, really. For anyone who doesn't know David Tredinnick, he's one of the foremost scientific minds in our Parliament, in that he regularly promotes homeopathy and herbal medicine. And he was actually on record as saying that surgeons refuse to operate when there's a full moon because blood doesn't clot when there's a full moon. So that's the stellar mind that we're dealing with, and it has to be said that an insult coming from him really does feel like a compliment, especially if you judge your level of success by the quality of the feathers that you rustle. So what I like about the fact that good thinking is a theme, and it's kind of obviously the name of the organization that I work for, is that it's fundamentally kind of positive in approach. It's not about handing down truths from an ivory tower and telling people what's right and what's wrong. It's the process. It's thinking, evaluating, investigating, and reasoning things out. And for me, this is a key point in skepticism, really. It's about how to think and not what to think, as it's been famously said plenty of times. And often people ask me when I give a talk here or I give a talk there about the various work that we're doing, whether I think critical thinking should be taught in school and whether we should tell kids that homeopathy is nonsense. And I always say to those people, well, yes to the first bit and no to the second bit, because we absolutely should be encouraging people to have the tools to reason out and figure what works and what doesn't work and understand what claims are true. But to just give people a list of stuff not to believe would be counterproductive, I think. I think the last thing we want is someone walking their way past their local homeopaths and laughing about how ridiculous it is as they take the next turn into their chiropractor. So it's really important that we help people have the tools to evaluate what works and what doesn't, to teach critical thinking in that kind of way. People need the tools to recognize nonsense for themselves. And I think that's a key role that we as skeptics should be playing, really, is to figure out ways of engaging with the audience, getting their brains working, getting them to understand how to tell what's true and what's not. Another thing people ask me about a lot when I talk about the work that we're doing is how you engage with people you disagree with and how you try and convince them or demonstrate to them that they're wrong. It's obviously a key issue for us in skepticism. And I think partly they ask me because I do the show Be Reasonable, which I'm not sure if anybody here has listened to. It's a show where I interview people who are completely wrong on an issue from a very different point of view to myself. But instead of having an antagonistic conversation, we try and be polite. Do we have any listeners here? Is there anyone who listens to it? Is there anyone who could listen to a full episode without having to stop and calm down? This is what I get told a lot. Yeah, it's this is what I always get told. People come up to me and say, I love the show, I cannot listen to it at all. I find it impossible to listen to it. It's a genius marketing strategy where even your most ardent listeners can't make it through an entire episode without being too frustrated that they start shouting at their iPod. So yeah, for people who don't listen, I've had guests on there where people believe the world is flat and they think they can live without food or water. They think it's a good idea to stand outside of abortion clinics handing out baby clothes to the women who are going in to have a procedure. And I've interviewed homophobic AIDS denialists, really quite horrible people. Jim Humble, who's the head of the group who give out miracle mineral supplement, industrial bleach to people with all sorts of terminal diseases. And instead of having a slanging match where I shout at them and tell them how wrong they are, we try and have a polite conversation. I think this is, for me, a key point in my approach to skepticism, which is not to just tell people they're wrong, but to try and lead them around their own beliefs, so maybe they'll see whether they're wrong for themselves. Because I think when you have a conversation with someone and you are just attacking their beliefs, they get incredibly defensive, their portcullis comes up, and they just give you the same justifications and defenses that they've given everybody who's ever questioned them. Whereas if you go in and you're asking them because you're genuinely interested, why do you think this point? This part of your belief, I find it very hard to understand this. Could you lead me past that? How do you get over this hurdle? If you do that with enough genuine inquiring spirit, I think sometimes you can lead people around the maze of their beliefs. And if you've got them in that position where they're able to respect you in a conversation and follow you in a conversation, sometimes you can get them to take a left turn in their mind that they've never taken before, and they're suddenly confronted with a brick wall that they don't know how to get through. And it's always an interesting moment in conversation. I think that's a useful approach in trying to reason with people who may not be necessarily reasonable in their views. But it's also harder when it's people you know, people you might kind of love and care about. How do you have these conversations with people that are members of your family or loved ones who fundamentally disagree with you on a point, and they're wrong on a scientific point? They are promoting homeopathy for all sorts of illnesses, things like that. And this is a point that people ask me about a lot too. And I think the best metaphor I have for how I go about those conversations is when you think about in films, when you see there's an asteroid going to come and destroy the Earth, this cataclysmic event, this asteroid going to wipe out all life on Earth. And you see the Armageddon approach of sending up Bruce Willis to blow the asteroid up, and then you have the same massive asteroid hitting the planet at a much wider spread and doing just as much damage because you've hit it head on and you've created an awful lot of noise and heat, but no light, no illumination, and nothing really good has come of that. Whereas I think, I could be wrong, but the current thinking on how to actually deal with an asteroid like that would be to send something up with the right kind of mass that slowly over time the gravity changes the direction of that asteroid so it's no longer on a collision course. And that's the metaphor I use for how you have these conversations with people you disagree with. If you go on head on and tell them they're idiots, tell them they're wrong, I think you end up with this big explosion and not really much production. Whereas if you're up there and you're able to just give them the little questions that they start to question for themselves, maybe you can slowly change the direction of their thinking so they're no longer on a collision course. For me as well, good thinking as a theme is all about activism. And I've been a skeptical activist for something like 7 years, something like that. And there's a few things that I've learned along the way. I don't pretend to be an expert and know everything, but I've seen a few things along the way. I think it's really important that we understand what we're up against. What do the people that we're talking about believe? What are they actually doing? How are they selling these things to people? That we go and have these experiences in person. I always say to people, if you have the chance to go along to see a psychic or go to a Mind, Body, Spirit festival or have your palm read, take that opportunity at least once. And yes, it might cost you a little bit of money, and if you can afford it, I think you should. I always say to people you can do it, because I think the price of admission is the cost of an education. I've never been to see a psychic or had my palm read or go to Mind, Body, Spirit Festival and not learned something useful. I think it's really, really key, and sometimes what you learn is how people fall for these beliefs, how people get convinced, the emotionally vulnerable positions they can be on the way in. And I think this makes you a much more compassionate skeptic if you aren't the one saying, well, it's all nonsense, these people, they deserve to be conned if they're going to be gullible enough to believe it. When you see in person someone fundamentally upset and fundamentally kind of hurting, and they're sold this untruth in their most vulnerable position, then I think you have a much better understanding of the rhetoric that gets them there and the counter-rhetoric that might get them out of there. And then the next time you come across someone who might be susceptible to those beliefs, maybe you've got the right kind of tools, the right questions, the right knowledge, so you don't sound like someone who's just spouting off with no real understanding. Obviously, face-to-face skepticism isn't necessarily everyone's cup of tea, and that's fine. You know, not everyone has to do everything. Not everyone has to do, there's no set way of doing skepticism. It's okay to take different approaches. I think skepticism needs all sorts of different approaches, different people, different skill sets. It's a matter of finding the thing that you can do and following that story wherever it goes. I think that's a real key, is just seeing what fits your skills, what fits your interests, and seeing what little difference you can make. But yeah, when you find when you find yourself presented with an opportunity to do something, I say take it. Even if it's something as small as making complaints to the media about this terrible story that you saw on the TV or the radio, or even writing to your local political representative so they know you exist. Because the people we disagree with will be writing to those people. And if all they ever do is, if the media and politicians only ever hear from people who are annoyed because homeopathy might be more stringently regulated in the future, and we never have those conversations on the other side, maybe the people in those positions think, clearly, the public are for homeopathy here because I don't hear from anybody who disagrees with it. So the more that we can do even little things like that, I think are very important. And one of the things I'll talk about in my presentation tomorrow is that looking at the way that the NHS in the UK funds homeopathy, government spending on homeopathy. At one point I just sent off a random freedom of information request to a place, the homeopathic hospital in Scotland, to see how much they spend on homeopathy. And that freedom of information request ended up getting reported in a national newspaper up in Scotland, which ended up actually with parts of the NHS withdrawing funding because of the scandal of this story causing. And it was an email's work for me, and I had no idea, no anticipation that I could go on and do these ridiculous things. So you never know what effect the little action you take can have until you take it. And it's the butterfly effect, I think. Even daft, silly, interesting, weird things can go in useful directions. You know, one minute you're encouraging groups of people to take homeopathic overdoses for the 1023 campaign. Was anyone in the 1023 campaign when it happened in 2011? There's a couple of hands up. I guess the rest of them all died. I don't know. Maybe I've got blood on my hands after all. It's just the experiment takes a while to come through. But no, I led the 1023 campaign internationally. You know, one idea was, one minute it was a daft little idea in a pub in Liverpool. The next there's 1,700 people in 32 countries taking homeopathic overdoses. And as a result, sales of homeopathy in Poland dropped by 17% after 1023. So your little ideas can have these effects you'd never anticipate. I think overall the biggest thing that I've learned being a skeptical activist with good thinking is to be tenacious, to follow things wherever they go, to not let something go, to find the subject or the issue that you want to tackle, and to just keep on it. And I think that's the really important thing. And that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow when I talk about the success in our government in fighting government funding homeopathy in the UK. The tenacity and following the story wherever it went, no matter how boring it got, part of it will get a bit boring, but it's work that needs to be done, and it's really useful. It plays a huge role in the victories that you can have. And the good thing is I think you can call on the enthusiasm of the skeptical community, because there's so many people out there wanting to help, but looking for something to do, looking for the way to do it. I think there's the old kind of skeptical adage that directing skeptics is like herding cats. And I don't think I've ever subscribed to that idea. And I think the key is if you try and tell a bunch of skeptics exactly what to do and tell them, follow me, do it this way, then I think people will start, because we're naturally semi-contrarian figures, we might start thinking, well, why are you telling me what to do? But if you ask someone for help, if you say, I've got this idea, but I need help, I need people to help me out on this, everyone needs to fill in this government consultation, if we all do it, then we'll have an effect, then I think people are overwhelmingly willing to help in the skeptical community. And we've got a lot of enthusiasm and passion out there, and I think it's all about directing that towards the things that can be helpful. And it really does fill me with a huge amount of optimism when I see what's happening in the skeptical community and how many people out there are willing to try and do something to change things for the better. I do believe that the skeptical community worldwide has a vast amount of enthusiasm and passion and expertise and determination. And by bringing all those things together and by working with and learning from colleagues all around the world, that's why it's a pleasure to be here talking to people. I'm sure I'll learn a lot from speaking to people here, and maybe it's things I can use when I go back home. So I think we need to kind of keep our networks together and learn from our friends all around the world. I'm really optimistic about what we can achieve. So I hope this conference inspires a few people to get more involved in skeptical activism, to get out there and try and find the little ways that you can try and improve things. And I'm sure there are plenty of people speaking and plenty of people here who've got great ideas about how your time and your enthusiasm can be directed towards something good. So I hope people keep looking out for those opportunities all weekend, and I hope people have a fantastic conference. It looks like an excellent weekend we've got ahead of us. Thank you.